Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. One night 3 years ago, I got into a fight with my girlfriend at the time. In my rage, I stormed out of her house, got into my truck, and then just started driving. I hopped on the interstate and drove, and about an hour later, I was in Nashville, but I was still so pissed I decided to keep driving. I made it my goal to reach Kentucky and then turn around. I'd never been to Kentucky before, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, and when I reached there, it was about 2:30 in the morning, having left my town a little after 12:30. I grabbed a Coke and a biscuit from the first McDonald's I found, and then headed back to Alabama. As I was heading back, I realized I was running low on gas as I got to Nashville, so I pulled off Interstate 65, went down the off-ramp and hit a light. I made a left and hit another light. And here's where it gets weird. As I pulled up to this light, I noticed something strange. The only car on the road was stopped at the green light to the right. Weird, I thought, but hey, it's after 3 at this point. The guy could be tired. Once I reached the red light, however, the car rolled forward through the light and under the overpass for the interstate. And then I saw its brake lights on and their headlights go out. They stopped under the overpass, and my heart started to race. I was sitting in the turning lane waiting for the light, and the gas station was right past the overpass, and that's where they were there waiting for me. I was freaking out. I watched my light turn green, then back to red. I was waiting to see if he would move, but they didn't. Finally, when the light switched to green again, I flicked on my high beams and crept through the intersection, trying to make out their face, but I couldn't. Then, lo and behold, as soon as I passed them, their headlights turned on, and they started moving again. At this point, I was scared shitless, staring at the headlights in my rearview mirror instead of the road, as I made the couple hundred of feet to the gas station. Thankfully, when I pulled in, the first thing I noticed was a cop car parked out front. So, I parked at the pump, and as I was getting out, I watched the car pull into the station and park. I started pumping my gas, and as soon as I was doing so, I watched a man exit the vehicle and start to walk inside the store. The whole time from the second his head popped out of the car to when he made it inside the store, he was staring at me, smiling like the soldier in that famous picture who was suffering from shell shock, and he was shaking his head left to right. He walked into the store and got in line right behind the cop. Now, maybe I've been watching too many movies, but the whole time he was standing there, I thought he was going to kill the cop, and thankfully he didn't. Once I had enough gas to get home, I stopped pumping, jumped in my car, and double-checked my phone for directions back to the interstate. As I was leaving the gas station, though, I noticed the man leave his place in line and run out of the store. That's when I panicked and I hit the gas. I ran the red light at the overpass, ran another red light, and then got back onto the interstate. I went about 85 to 90 miles an hour all the way home, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Still, one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me, and it reiterated to me what the detective told all incoming freshmen at orientation. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. Crazy Road Trip, submitted by Heru Black. Here's something that happened to me and 2 other friends a couple of years back. Sorry it's so long, but it takes place over the course of a week. It was a pretty messed up road trip, and we didn't realize how scary it was until a few years later, because the entire time we were very, very high. It was March 2014, and my friends and I'll call them Steve and Karen, had just started a band together. I'm a guy who was pretty outgoing and friendly, and Steve was a quiet kid who was pretty masculine, or at least thought he was. He came from a suburban town in Cape Cod where he was valedictorian and also the class clown. Karen was a small, dirty blonde, pretty shy and quiet, but very friendly. An ex-scene kid like me, we both had hair over our eyes. Steve and Karen were in the beginnings of a relationship. We were in college and spring break was coming up soon. We had no plans, so we decided we were going to drive from Massachusetts to Florida to do some camping in some national forests, and then drive to New Orleans if we had the time. We weren't really experienced campers or road trippers, but we were depressed 19-year-olds who felt pretty invincible and had nothing better to do, so we figured, what the hell. That Sunday night, Karen had gotten us our first show in her home state of Connecticut, and I'm pretty sure we left right after. The ride down was nice, but an exhausting 24 hours. We got to Florida on Monday night around 1 a.m., tired as hell. We were so tired, and we'd been smoking, we didn't even try to find a campground. We pulled over and set up the tent in a slightly wooded area about 10 feet off the road. When we woke up and left the tent, we realized we'd actually been camping in a ditch, which we thought was pretty funny. We made it our goal that day to find a real campsite. Of course, we'd been smoking, and while we were at a gas station, Karen decided she was just going to go into the convenience store and ask people about any good camping spots. She came out having spoken to 2 rednecks who said they could lead us to some really good spots. Again, we were pretty high and thought, hey, this is great. The locals will definitely show us the best spots. We followed their pickup truck, smoking a bit more, until we ended up in the woods near a slow, shallow river. We got out, and they started telling us about what a great campsite this was in their thick hick accents. We've got a lot of firewood, they said. We've been cutting it up, and we'd be happy to share it. You can swim right over there, but don't go out too far. There's gators out here. They were really trying to sell us this campsite. I thought the shorter redneck was kind of hot, chubby with a beard. You can ask my friends. I'm pretty much a bad man detector. If you think a guy is attractive or get a crush on one, you should run far away. I went up to Steve while they were talking to Karen about sharing food or something. We should, tell them we're going to go get firewood or something and just not come back, I said. He agreed, too high to remember the firewood they just offered to share with us 10 minutes before, and we used that same excuse. In the car, Karen said she'd been feeling weird about the way they were talking to her too, and was glad we'd come up with some way to slip away. Wouldn't it be so funny if we looked back and they were just following us? I said, trying to be funny. Don't even fucking joke about that, Karen said. Then I said, guys, looking back. Sure enough, there was the dirty old pickup truck, not 50 feet behind us. Super freaked out, we drove around making a lot of sharp turns. They kept up, though stayed at a distance. It had been a few hours of us frantically driving, and the sun had set, and we thought we'd lost them in the dark. It was probably around 10 at night or so when we found a campground you had to pay for, but we couldn't find anywhere to pay, so we just drove in, found a nice spot, and set up camp. We hadn't actually gotten any firewood, so super high, Karen and I set out into the dark to find anything we could burn. We kept joking about how the rednecks were going to jump out and get us, but Karen really started freaking out, saying, "Oh my God, we're so far from the campsite. We're lost. We're never going to find our way back, and the rednecks are going to find us and kill us." I reassure her and say, "Dude, we're literally 20 feet from the car. Look, the trees aren't even that thick. We can still see it." Yeah, we were high. We gathered a bunch of logs and some branches from trees that kind of looked like palm trees but were short and grew like bushes. We got back, and Steve had already started the fire with things that he'd found, so we broke out some sausages and cooked them over the fire and drank an entire bottle of wine. Extremely hungover, we got some groceries in the morning, and I got sick after eating an entire thing of birthday cake Oreos. Just before sunset, we found another campsite on the outskirts of the Ocala forest, about 100 feet from a road. We could see car headlights going by through the trees, and there were occupied campsites around, so we felt pretty safe. We smoked some more, made some food, and I was surprised I could still get some cell service, and I used the super slow internet on my phone to look up scary stories specifically about the Ocala forest. I found some stories about the Rainbow People, a supposed cult that lived in the Ocala forest and tried to make other people live there too. It didn't seem that scary, so we were disappointed after having waited about 10 minutes for the website to load. But suddenly, we heard a creak in the woods, just outside the light of the fire. We didn't think much of it until we heard a bunch more, all around us. It sounded like footsteps on the leaves. As always, very high, we started freaking out. We didn't think the rednecks would have followed us this far, but we still weren't sure, and having just watched the Blair Witch Project together a few weeks before, I joked, maybe it's the Ocala Witch. Steve told us to wait at the fire while he went to the car and turned the headlights on. Karen and I stood back to back with our pocket knives out, still not knowing if we were freaking out for no reason. Once Steve got the headlights on and drove closer to us, we got in and he did some donuts while we looked around to make sure everything was clear. When we were sure there wasn't anyone there, we joked more about this Ocala Witch and decided it was time to just go to sleep. We poured some water on the fire and got in the tent. We'd been laying in our sleeping bags for about 10 minutes when we noticed some light to the side of the tent. Our fire had started back up, and we were pretty freaked out since we dumped most of our water on it. The fire started to grow, and it got pretty big. "Is anybody gonna go check on the Ocala Witch?" I said, looking over to Karen and Steve, who both looked at me and nodded no. Too scared to leave the tent, we eventually fell asleep, and when we woke up, the fire pit was still smoking, and it was completely ash. I mean, maybe it's explainable, but we were pretty scared at the time because some of the ash was a very distinct shade of blue. Steve tied some sticks together into figures and put them around the campsite to freak us out while we were packing up. Real funny. That night, we decided to go deeper into Ocala. We were driving around the forest looking for a camping spot while I was reading stories about the skunk ape that I'd loaded onto my phone in advance. Of course, we were still smoking, and it was pretty late, really dark, and we were tired. We started to think we might have gone too deep to find a campsite, but the path was wide enough for a car, so why wouldn't there be a good spot? We came upon a line of cars in the middle of the forest, mostly looking pretty broken down with some graffiti on them. We kept going, and soon there were a bunch of people walking around. We drove up to one of them, a very tall, very bearded man who could have been the skunk ape himself. Rolling the window down just enough to talk to him, I asked, "Hey, what is this?" "A gathering," he said abruptly, with a really deep voice. "Of what?" I asked, confused. "Of people." We'd managed to stumble upon the Rainbow Gathering, the cult we read about the night before. Turns out, they were just hundreds of hippies living in the woods and were very hospitable. One guy, whose name I can't remember, decided to show us around, and he was really nice and introduced us to a bunch of people. The greeting and farewell was, "Lovin' you." He introduced us to his wife, who was pregnant with their 7th child. Everyone, again, was really nice. They taught us all about how they lived in the woods. If you got lost at night, you yelled, "Hey, I need an adult!" and someone would come find you. If you needed tobacco, you yelled, "Nick at night!" and there was a group that would come and give you some. They called lighters fire dragons, the outside world Babylonia, and didn't trade with money, which they referred to as Babylonian tickets, but rather they traded shiny rocks and pretty stuff. We were really high and having a lot of fun. They got us some food and took us to a drum circle, and they were all over the forest, sometimes 10 or 15-minute walks between sites. We knew it was a little weird, but we decided to go along with it. At one point, an old guy had Karen in his lap next to a bonfire, sipping on some mystery liquid from a thermos, but she seemed happy, so we didn't think much of it. We also met the one black hippie who was there, who only beatboxed, and he never spoke. We hung out with them for a couple of more hours before we got tired. There were different camps throughout the forest, and our guide led us to his, which was called Camp Shut the Fuck Up. It was the quiet camp for all the parents with kids. We set up our tent and went to sleep. I woke up first and read a book in the tent since it was raining. By the time Karen and Steve woke up, the rain had stopped, and we went to hang out with some of the people at Camp Shut the Fuck Up. We talked with them for a little while and listened to their stories. Someone was talking pretty casually about how a girl had been dosed at another camp, and she was going crazy or something. We figured out through the context clues that dosed meant someone had given her a large amount of acid without her knowledge, and she understandably freaked out. We realized how weird the whole thing was and decided it was time to pack up and leave. As we were taking down the tent, we started to hear it. "You're doing it wrong." We heard people chanting. Not in unison, but randomly, one after another. We looked back, and there were a few people walking towards us. "You're doing it wrong," they kept shouting. We continued to dismantle the tent while one of them approached us. "You guys are packing up after only one night?" Karen replied, "Yeah, we want to get to New Orleans today." The guy replied, "No, you guys should stay longer. We've been living here for months. Gotta stay away from Babylonia. All that shit rots your brain." When we weren't receptive, they started getting more aggressive. "Check out these Babylonians. You're doing it wrong." I looked at him and said, "Dude, we have to be back at school in like 3 days." Someone from the back of the growing group of hippies between us and the path of Camp Shut the Fuck Up yelled out, "Quit school! Come live in the woods with us!" Someone else shouted, "Someone get the duct tape!" Karen got mad and started arguing with them about us going to school. They were saying that we weren't doing anything by going to Babylonian school. And Karen argued that we were going to school so we could learn what we needed to actually make change in the world instead of just sitting in the forest and doing acid and littering. Finally, after what seemed like an hour with all these people yelling at us, we finished packing up the tent, and Karen had convinced some of them that we were on the same side and just doing it different ways. I think she just outsmarted them, really. And they let us through, and our guide let us out of the forest, apologizing for the rest of them. "You're lucky we didn't duct tape you to a tree," someone shouted. It was about a half-hour walk back to the car, and whenever someone saw us with all of our gear, they shouted, "You're doing it wrong," or "Hey, have fun in Babylonia." We finally got to the forest entrance, and we met our guide's wife again, still very pregnant. She looked each of us in the eyes, smiled at us, and put her hands on our shoulders, and hugged us as if to say, "I'm glad you're getting out. I wish I could too." We drove to a park on the coast where manatees were supposed to swim, but I guess it was the wrong time of the year, so we just drove through a weird suburban island town before heading to New Orleans. We got there pretty late, and we were again exhausted. We couldn't find anywhere to set up camp because we were in a city, and we didn't really think this through. We found a lawn between a stadium and its parking lot, and Steve wanted to sleep in the tent, but Karen and I thought it was too cold and we should just sleep in the car. Steve still set up the tent, determined to sleep in it, and because they were kind of together, Karen decided she would too. I woke up to a flashlight blinding my face and someone banging on the window. I open the door and instantly the alarm goes off. There's 2 cops standing there, bewildered, asking me where the keys were so I could turn off the alarm, and I pointed to the tent about 10 feet away. Meanwhile, in the tent, the alarm had woken Steve and Karen up, and they thought someone had broken into the car, and if it hadn't been for the fact that I was in it, they would have been too scared to come out of the tent. However, they unzipped the tent with their knives ready, only to see the 2 cops. The cops called them over, asked to see all of our IDs, and asked what we were doing so far from home. We told them that we just didn't have anything else to do for spring break. They ran our IDs, and they said it was cold and that Steve and Karen could go back to the tent and I could go back in the car while they did it. Okay, I'm black and frequented Tumblr, where I had heard about police brutality and the latest minority killing by a cop on a daily basis. Oh God, we're in Louisiana. They're separating us because they're going to shoot me, I thought. Steve and Karen back in the tent had similar thoughts. They knocked down the window and called my friends from the tent, and luckily they didn't kill me. They told us to be safe, and then they went on their way. The rest of the trip was fine. We walked around New Orleans and hung out with some homeless travel kids on a pier. I bought them whiskey, and we thought it was funny that I was the only one that didn't need a chaser. Just as the sun was setting, we took off to make the day-and-a-half drive back home. And we made it back just in time to go to sleep and get up for school the next day. We were super lucky. I mean, the only reason we weren't more scared or observant was because we were high the entire time. A couple of years later, again, while high, we recounted the events to each other and realized just how dumb we'd been. We may laugh about it now, but there were so many times on that trip where things could have gone horribly wrong. Don't sleep on the side of the road. About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion pretty late at night, and the drive was about 2 hours. I didn't stay the night because I had to be back for work the following day, and most of the drive was on roads with dense bushes and trees on either side, the really creepy ones you see in a lot of movies. Anyway, I've been driving about 45 minutes, and I was starting to get really tired. You know how sometimes you suddenly just become really tired out of nowhere? Well, yeah, that happened to me. I knew I wasn't going to last, but I didn't come across any place that I felt I could park and safely sleep. After it became clear to me that I wasn't going to find a place to pull up, my tiredness wasn't going away, I did something very questionable. I pulled over to the side of the road onto the grass behind some bushes to try and hide my car from anyone else who was going to come past. The roads weren't empty. I came across another car every few minutes or so. I just made a mental note that the time was 11:22, and then fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awoken by a scratching sound. I looked at the clock, 11:50. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and because I was still extremely tired, I didn't bother looking around and simply went back to sleep. I was later awoken by the same sound again. It was now around 12:40. This time it really freaked me out because the sound didn't stop. The thought ran across my mind that maybe it was just an animal inspecting the car, but why would it return almost an hour after it had left the previous time? I looked in my rearview mirror and just managed to catch a glimpse of something running away into the forest. Now, at the time, I thought it was the damn hook killer. You know, the one that scratches the couple's car and then slaughters the guy when he gets out to investigate? Fuck that, I thought to myself, so I got the hell out of there. There was a bend no more than 100 yards up the road, and as I came around it, there was a fucking car parked off to the side of the road with the driver's side door open. I slowed down just to look to see if there was anyone in there, and there wasn't. And then I looked in my rearview mirror again. At first I didn't see anything, and all of a sudden, this guy came sprinting around the corner. He was screaming at me, shouting stuff like, "Hey, you, get the fuck out of your car now!" I noped the fuck out of there and sped off, and I never saw the guy again. Moral of the story? Don't fucking sleep on the side of a deserted road. He's getting closer. When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip, when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning, so around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour, and we still had a few more hours to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me, because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road," he said. "He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. And by this time, my siblings and I were hyper-aware of the car too, and entertained ourselves with watching it through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. But we got pretty tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother said, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel," she finally said. And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and this car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to turn its brights on, like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over, right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel." And my dad did. The car kept driving, and I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as my dad parked the car right in front of him. He came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us, and how it was taunting us. The policeman took her claim seriously and told us that people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals all the time. He then offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. So, relieved, we drove off with the police cruiser behind us, until about 10 minutes later when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's word and my mother's worst fears. That 10 minutes later, we saw the same car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting for us. Driving Cross Country, submitted by Terry from the Block. Back in 2009, I decided I was tired of my day job and wanted a change of scenery from the cold doldrums of Newark, New Jersey. I spoke with some friends from college that were living in San Francisco, and they convinced me to go out west too. I could crash with them as long as I liked until I found a job. So, from Thanksgiving time to March, I saved all of my money, did the nothing but ramen thing, then loaded up my hand-me-down Ford Explorer and planned my drive across the states. My father had bought me a Thule carrier for the roof, so with my little U-Haul trailer, I had everything all set to go, and I planned on sleeping in the back of the Explorer a couple of nights to save money. I didn't tell anyone I was going to do that, let alone my parents, who would have freaked out at that possibility. Before I go any further, I should let everyone know that I'm a petite female, 5'5", and weigh about 110 pounds. I was an avid runner back then and still am now, and was and am in very good shape if I do say so myself. I did a lot of kickboxing and training at the gym, so I thought if I did get into trouble, I'd be able to take care of myself. Back to the story. My plan was to head south first and then drive across through Tennessee, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona, and then head up through Southern California. It was adding about 10 hours of time to the drive, but I figured I'd stop and see things on the way and just kind of take my time. On my first leg, I drove to Roanoke, Virginia, and stopped for the night. Not a problem at all. I found a hotel that seemed like a decent spot to park in for the night, and then I walked to a local restaurant, got something to eat, cleaned up in their bathroom, and then crashed in my truck listening to the rain on the roof. The next day, I made for Memphis, and I figured I'd stop there, maybe see Graceland, and then get a room for the night, and that's exactly what I did. About 9 hours on the road, and I was getting sick of being in the car, and I drove by Graceland. It was too late to stop in, so I found myself at a Motel 6, and here is where the trouble began. Right away, I knew something was wrong with the place. I mean, it was seedy, and I mean seedy. What can you expect from a place like that, right? But it wasn't until too late that I thought something was wrong. I got some more food and found that the back door to the building wasn't locked at all. I mean, it was wide open. Some security. I went to the front desk to tell them that this was unacceptable, but no one there spoke very good English, and I just gave up and went to my room and turned all the locks I could on and then pushed a chair up against the door. I knew what kinds of people were probably staying at a cheap-ass joint like this. The next morning, I got up early, showered, and was going to get on the road right away. But there was an issue. There was this guy standing by my truck looking into the windows. Not being a shy girl, I walked right up to him and asked him what he was doing. He jumped a little and then turned around. Then he smiled at me and said he liked my truck. I said, "That's nice," and then asked him to back away from it and told him that I was in a hurry. I took a good look at him as he stepped away with his hands up to his chest. "Sorry, pretty lady. No offense. Hey, can I buy you breakfast?" he asked. He was about 6 feet tall, dark hair, dark complexion, thin and not unattractive, but he just seemed weird. I mean, staring into my truck like he was going to break into it and then ask me to breakfast just made things even stranger. I politely said, "No thanks," and just got behind the wheel and started to drive off. He sort of stood off to the side and waved at me, and I watched him continue to look at me in my side view mirror. Oh well, I thought as I pulled onto the road, some local goofball, whatever. I stopped for gas and got back on the highway and put some miles in. I finally stopped in Sallisaw, Oklahoma to stretch, get some food and gas, and my friend Gene called me and asked where I was, and we chatted for a few minutes, and while I sat in my truck eating, I looked over and couldn't believe my eyes. Standing by the edge of the parking lot next to a dirty white car was the guy from the Memphis parking lot. He was looking at a map spread out under the hood of his car, but every once in a while, he looked up at me, or at least in the direction of my truck. He couldn't see me face to face, but he was definitely looking in my direction. I told Jean about him, and she said I was probably mistaken and was just creeped out about the meeting that I had with him in the morning. When I looked over again, the car was there, but the guy wasn't. I agreed with Jean that it was probably just a silly coincidence, and maybe it was just someone else that looked like that guy. Got some more gas, and then got back on the interstate. I wasn't tired, and after one or two more pit stops, I made it to Amarillo and planned on sleeping in the back of the truck again. I wrote an email to my parents saying something about how fast it went from being the start of spring in one area to the brown of Texas in the next instant. I was shot, so I drifted away and didn't wake up until about 2 in the morning. That's when I heard something right outside of my truck. I was parked in an Embassy Suites this time to avoid the creep factor or a cheap place, but that didn't help things at all. I opened my eyes to see a flashlight pointing in on me, and I immediately screamed. The light didn't go out for a second, and I thought maybe it was hotel security or the police. But then the light turned off, and whoever was out there bumped the side of my truck as they turned around, and I saw a tall, dark shape run away, and then under a parking lot light. Yeah, it looked like that guy. I freaked out, scrambled to put my sneakers on. I was only wearing a t-shirt and a pair of Umbro soccer shorts, and I felt so violated and naked, wondering how long that person was staring in at me. I thought of the guy as I pulled out of the parking lot, and after a few minutes, I pulled over and called Jean. She was still up and hanging out with my other friends, and I told them all what had happened. I was too keyed up to go back to sleep, so I made for Albuquerque, about 4 hours or so away, by Chris's MapQuest search that he did on his laptop for me. On the way there, I stopped once for coffee and gas, but there wasn't a lot of traffic on Interstate 40. I was trying to calm myself down and reassure myself that it was probably just security that looked in on me, and then they got scared when I screamed. But suddenly, a car behind me came up with its brights on. They were right in my side view mirror, and I had to dodge my head over to get the light out of my eyes. Whoever this was stayed behind me for about 5 miles, and by that time I was yelling out curse words and telling him to turn his effing brights off. I slowed down, and the car slowed down too. I started to pull over to give this person even more room to pass if that's what he wanted to do, so it wasn't an issue, but suddenly the car sped right past me. It was the white car I had seen at the Sonic. I was sure of it. I waited a few minutes and then started driving again, really freaking out. I got out my phone and dialed Jean again, and I was so busy freaking out on her that I didn't notice the white car had slowed down and now I was passing it. The car got behind me again, and of course, on came the brights. Now I was really panicking, and I didn't know what to do. After about 10 minutes of me screaming and crying to Jean, the car again went around me and sped into the distance, and I took the next exit to a Flying J, hoping to throw this person off. There was a police car in the lot, and I went right over to him and blathered out my story. The police officer was very nice and listened to me and asked a lot of questions. Where I was from, where I was going, who I knew was out here, stuff like that. Even down to had I been drinking or doing any drugs. He decided that I hadn't been and suggested I get a room in town. He radioed a description of the car out to all the other officers so they would be aware of what was going on, and he led me to a Holiday Inn, and I got a room after parking in the back. The officer said he'd follow up with me later, and Jean called me back and I told her where I was and then just crashed. I woke up in the morning and called my parents and let them know what was going on. And the officer came to the hotel before he went off shift and said that they hadn't seen anything and that I was probably okay to keep moving. I went to get some food, and when I got back to my truck, on the windshield written in what I think was toothpaste were the words, "Nice try." I freaked the hell out and called the police again. They came out, took pictures of my windshield, and made me do a formal statement. I didn't know whether to scream or cry or what. I called my parents again, and my dad wanted to come and get me, but ended up buying a plane ticket for Jean to fly to Albuquerque and then finish the drive with me. Somewhat calmer, I asked the police officer about a different place to spend the night before driving to Albuquerque, and they said to leave my truck at the Holiday Inn, and then drove me to this quirky little place called the Blue Swallow Motel. Whoever was following me, I just didn't want them to know where I was. Strangely enough, the Blue Swallow Motel was actually pretty cool, and I actually still have some pictures that I took of it before I actually went to bed. I spent the rest of my day sleeping and was planning on getting a ride back to the hotel early in the next morning to get my truck and then driving to meet Jean in the morning. I woke up at about 4 and I was feeling a little better, and the police said that they would take me to my truck, which I was very thankful for. While I was on the phone with them, I looked out the window of my room, and there was that friggin' white car in the parking lot. I didn't freak out this time. I calmly told the police that the car was there, and they said to stay put. But just as if he had heard me, the car lights came on, and it tore out of the parking lot. I wanted out of this so bad at this point and was beyond shaken up. I wanted to either go home or be in San Francisco with my friends. The police came, others were driving around looking for the car and driver, but I insisted I needed to get out of there. A police car followed me for quite a while once I got back on the interstate, and nothing happened for the rest of my drive to Albuquerque. I went to the airport in the morning, Jean got there, and then we drove non-stop to San Francisco. About a week later, I was cleaning out the back of my truck when I found a piece of paper folded up. I thought it was just a piece of garbage for my trip, but I opened it anyway, and inside, written in crude, kid-like letters, was the message, "You got lucky. I have to go home." I ran inside my friend's apartment and showed it to her, and we called the police. There was obviously nothing much they could do about it, but they said they'd let the Tucumcari police know about it. That was the town that I had stopped in New Mexico. They did ask for it, and I gladly gave it to them after taking a picture of it. I didn't want that hanging around. So yeah, that was a messed up drive, and I will never drive cross-country again, even if I'm with people. I'll fly next time. I try not to think about it, but when my mind does wander to those days, I'm terrified as to what that person was planning on doing to me. It's scary to think about it, even to this day. Hey gang, thanks for listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Do me a favor, help keep this channel alive by sending me your true scary stories. Email anything you've got to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description below, and also consider becoming a patron of my channel. A link to my Patreon page is in the description as well, and for as little as $1 a month, you will be able to get access to content not available to anybody else and uploads before I upload to YouTube. And of course, if you like hearing episodes in podcast format that you can download, you can find me on Spreaker, TuneIn, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more. Everyone, be excellent to each other. I'll see you in the next episode. But until then, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.